Yeah, Jenny, I wanted to ask how you were doing in terms of, what we covered last week and how you're feeling about things. Have you put anything in place? Give me an idea. Have you set anything up in terms of your action plan? Or are you just thinking about it at this point?
The morning thing, I'm trying to make sure I start my day with my water, because it sort of comes undone during the day. So unless I get the water in the morning, it seems to be more like tea and rooibos tea and so on during for the rest of the day. So I've been doing that. Last week was a disaster as far as me getting onto any of the exercises you sent.
Okay.
Because I was sick, and also because of the time frame with all the events happening at school.
Okay.
So you start again, you get going again this week, and so that's what's been.
Okay.
I started the brushing.
Okay, great.
I got myself a brush.
Okay, lovely. And it's not. I mean, it's a bit of a mission, but it's nothing terribly. It doesn't take very long, does it?
No, it doesn't take long at all. And
super.
So that's. And then watching my carbs, counting carbs. I've been doing that very, very religiously.
Okay. And what have you noticed? Because you've been working with the keto thing for a while. Have you noticed that you are where you think you should be, or are you over? Are you slightly under?
No, I think it depends on what is being sent for us as supper.
Of course.
So it's quite difficult. So
that's hard.
Often the starch gets left off completely, and they'll send something, let's say, that's got a batter on it or something.
Yeah.
Which you don't pick your food.
But that's not really going to throw you out a huge amount, is it? I mean, it's more things like sandwiches and big potatoes and what?
I don't eat bread.
Okay.
I don't eat bread. I haven't eaten bread in a long time.
Okay.
It really makes me feel ill.
Okay.
So it's that sort of thing. And I think, what resonated with me a lot last week was it's taken so long for you to get, to put on the weight and so on, and it's not an overnight thing.
No.
So give yourself the time it's going to take. So, there's no, by next week or by December I've got to be.
No.
It's not going to be like that, because otherwise it's not going to become a lifestyle.
Yeah.
So it's just small steps every day. I think I'm more conscious of that for it to be something lasting.
Okay. That's music to my ears, that latter point, because I think that's a mistake we all make. It's not just, I'm make that mistake on other things, and it's just to kind of step back and go, why am I stressing? Like, why is there what's the rush? Where is this expectation of it must be done by a certain time? It's total self expectation, self pressure. So I think, yes, firstly, integration is much easier when it's a slow and sure process, because that way you're more likely to, those habits will become part of your lifestyle. And then the other thing is that you don't feel so desperate to have to see results quickly. And so that just means you're much more likely to enjoy the process of it and learn from the process of it, rather than it being just purely about results. So I think it's a good point, and I'm glad to hear that.
I think it's maybe it's the wrong thing, but I do get onto the scale in the morning. And I know you mentioned last week. What did you say?
It's just your relationship with gravity. What does it tell you?
And I think a nicer way definitely is on some of the clothes that I wear for teaching is just feeling them feel different on me. So I mean, from that angle, I'm not seeing massive results on the scale, but actually on clothing, it's better.
Great.
So that's a good start.
Great. Yeah, excellent. Yeah. Gosh, that's fantastic. Yeah, look,
just energy.
That's typically the first thing that people experience, is an increase in energy, and that's great, because that was one of your things, is energy.
Yes.
So that's really great.
The last 10 days, demands on me in the last 10 days. I mean, if I wasn't actually doing what I'm doing at the moment, I think it would have been a disaster.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So even though you haven't necessarily absorbed all of it or done the exercise or any of that, you're already in a better space, already in a better kind of mode. There was something I was going to say about something you just said. Okay, it'll come to me. But the weighing thing. What I typically, if I have a client who weighs, I really wouldn't weigh yourself daily. I really wouldn't. I would suggest. Look, I mean, it was funny. I was talking to a friend and I said I'd gotten on the scale because there's a scale at the gym. I got on. The last time I weighed myself was pre-COVID, which for us started in March 2020. And I got on the scale for the first time about 2 weeks ago, and it's better to keep it. Maybe once a month. Personally, I get husbands or wives of the clients that I have to throw the scale to hide it, basically, because I just think it's has the potential to make or break your day. You know that it's like either I feel fabulous about myself or crap. Based on my relationship with gravity. So look, I mean, it's fair to, you are testing with clothing, and it's a much better way to do it because it's about composition. And, obviously, if you are involved in exercise and you're starting to develop muscle, your muscle is much denser than fat, and so you're going to start being heavier. I told you that my BMI is like overweight towards obese, simply because I'm heavy and I'm dense. But and what was fascinating to me is I hadn't picked up an ounce, not anything, in that last year and a half. It was amazing, given that life had changed so fundamentally. But again, it goes down to just the habits that I have on a daily basis. It doesn't mean I don't eat crap. I mean, I'll happily eat an entire tub of Ben and Jerry's or Haagen-Dazs, or I'll have I can get down and dirty with the best of them. Yeah. So there is always room to let the hair down. It's just about what happens most of the time, as I said. And so that's proof in the pudding. That is proof in the pudding. If we're going through this kind of experience that we had in the UK was sort of more lockdown than South Africa was in terms of restrictions, but it can still work. And I think I proved that to myself when, I broke a foot the instep in Italy once, and I was put in a cast for I think 5 weeks, and I actually lost weight because I couldn't exercise, and I was much younger at that time, but I just focused on this keto thing, and I just kept it really, really clean, and I came out of that kind of dropping, which I wasn't trying for, but it was a side effect. So it's just the consistency. It's consistency. So it sounds like you're kind of on that, which is great. So I think it was lovely feedback. That's very nice, and I'd be interested to see where Elsner is in terms of that. Okay, so what we're going to do tonight is I thought we could just talk through keto, talk through some aspects of intermittent fasting we haven't actually covered yet, and just make sure that we're really sort of sound on the subject, because in menopause, keto looks slightly different to standard keto diets. So I want to just open up my presentation and show you. In the first instance, I think it's probably quite useful, and you may know all of this already, but it's quite useful to kind of understand the hormonal impact of menopause. I mean, we often talk about menopause, but in a very abstract way, because we kind of know it influences things, and we have effects. There are side effects, there are radical side effects. We're not necessarily very clear on why or how. And obviously, estrogen and progesterone are the two major key players, although estrogen is kind of top of the list. So even in the brain, we have these estrogen receptor sites, and you can imagine, as estrogen starts dropping, and those receptor sites are then impacted on by this lack of estrogen coming through. It's no wonder women start feeling like they're going mad, or that they are a completely different person to the person they knew all their lives. Suddenly they're they're forgetful, and they get depressed and anxious, and they just don't cope very well through certain aspects of it, and it's purely down to this hormonal decline. And actually, estrogen offers a very protective aspect to the brain, and so without that, we're much more at risk. So things like where are we? The aging, when estrogen comes down, we're exposed to things like the neuro diseases like Alzheimer's, but I think Alzheimer's specifically is one of those that is a key issue with this declining estrogen. What else? We've got, mood and memory, that's what estrogen does. It enhances concentrations of those. So it's no surprise, again, as it drops, that we become mushy-brained and more anxious and depressed. Progesterone as well is important, and GABA is one of those. I remember actually someone recommending it for my daughter when she was quite young, because she's not ADHD, and I don't like the sort of labeling of it, but she's got that tendency with a sort of low impulse control, and she's a bit all over the place, and her energy is extremely high. And GABA actually was quite a good one for just calming her headspace down. So that's quite a good one for this calming kind of. And of course, when that goes, it's like, what do we have to? We have to start practicing ways to actually calm ourselves, outside of the neurotransmitters we produce, and actually go into behavioral changes for that. Okay, so mood fluctuations, anxiety, and depression are an obvious side effect of those declining hormones. And then, of course, we've got the impact of menopause on diet. And that is, we covered some of this in the masterclass, but the fact is that estrogen ensures that the brain is receiving sugar, essentially, through glucose. And obviously, as estrogen goes down, you've got nothing kind of managing that process. So this idea of having stores of fatty acids, because even the leanest of us has got some storage site full of fatty acids. We hold on to a decent amount, because that's part of that survival mechanism. So using ketones is a better bet than glucose, because you have to replace fairly quickly. But ketones, because we've got this reserve of fatty acids, we essentially have a constant supply of those ketones, which can be converted then into glucose and used for brain fuel. So it's steady, it's clean, it reduces the symptoms like hot flushes, which is actually a very, very nice side effect to a keto diet, and the brain fog, of course, that comes with that low estrogen. Loss of libido. I mean, this is an interesting one, because a lot of women talk about this, and actually, when you bring more fat into the diet, look, the research was done on women with metabolic syndrome, which was that very, one of the key aspects of that is midriff fat. So, more the apple kind of shape starting. And they found that actually the higher fat diet helped with that, with sexual function. So that's quite nice also to know. The idea of adding more fat just really does make sense from so many different points of view. Okay, we spoke about this, and I've included, this was on the masterclass, and I'm going to remind you of this, because insulin is just such an important hormone in the body. It really, really is. It regulates the amount of sugar in the blood, and it's everything in terms of health. And we're going to be talking, and body fat. We're going to be talking at some point about glycemic variability as well in the future, which has got to do with the stability of your blood sugar, your highs and your lows, and how to, if we can squeeze that and keep it more stable, the impact that has, the positive impact that has. So we know that when blood sugar is too high, insulin is secreted by the pancreas. It pours into the bloodstream, it collects all that sugar, and it will take it to typically the liver or the muscle cells to be used as fuel. Okay. And if that happens enough over time, and I'm very aware that I'm looking at my screen and my camera is here, so excuse my eyes down. We're testing my external camera tonight. So, okay, so over time, if this occurs a hell of a lot, what happens is that the cells, they have a little kind of a knocker, and when insulin comes and knocks on that door, in their best state, in their most insulin sensitive state, they'll hear that knock straight away. But if we are constantly eating foods that cause an insulin response, then that reaction to the knock on the door becomes slower and slower, or requires more and more insulin in order to be heard. So it makes it much less efficient. And then what happens is that blood sugar levels remain high, and then weight gain or other related health issues like diabetes or metabolic syndrome are the consequence of that. So you always want to be insulin sensitive, not insulin resistant. And remember, I spoke about the fact that depending on, and this was sort of the perimenopause thing, is depending where a woman is in her cycle, one is either insulin resistant or insulin sensitive. So, and that's got to do with estrogen. In terms of the fluctuations of the hormones. Yeah. So, okay, lower estrogen is when you become resistant to insulin. So, and this is the problem with menopause, is that we are essentially glucose or insulin resistant. So it's kind of like we almost move into, it's not like moving into diabetes, but it's moving into where those carbs can really actually do quite a lot of damage. Because we are not handling it well, just purely hormonally. Again, in menopause, we produce high levels of ghrelin, which stimulates appetite, and that in turn promotes fat storage. And it's in particular around that midriff region. And then there was something else. It also raises cortisol levels, if I remember correctly. We naturally cortisol tends to come up a little higher, and then the chances of promoting, again, storage of fat, especially around the middle, is enhanced. So it's a double whammy. In fact, there are a number of things. Actually, I think that's on the next slide. But so actually in menopause, a 30 grams or below is a better bet. So that would be exactly what a diabetic would do. I think Noakes he does the sort of stringent 30 grams or below. I'm fairly relaxed with clients around this particular issue, but for menopause, unfortunately, it's one of those things. All right, so looking at the keto diet then, this is something you've seen before, you know this. It's the 20-25% of your calories being protein, 70 to 80 being fat, and 5 to 10 being net carbs. Okay, so that's your total value. And in fact, on here I should have changed this to 30 grams because 50 grams is sort of a standard protocol, but 30 grams is what we're looking for. It'll be slightly different for Elsona because she is still in a cycle, as am I, and so for strictly someone who's in menopause would be 30 grams. For someone who's not quite there, 50 grams is probably about right. Okay, so and because we've been through this and you've experienced that yourself, that a ketogenic diet depletes the glucose reserves. Okay, so it uses fats instead of carbohydrates as a source of fuel, and that's when you make that transition, because typically most people let me not say most people who tend to eat a diet of high carb are carb adapted. And so you have to go through this transition period, and we'll talk about that now in terms of what you're looking for to show you that you've transitioned. But the idea is to transition from being reliant on carbohydrates to being reliant on fats, because it's a much cleaner energy and it's a much smoother and more efficient process for the mitochondria. Okay. And we'll talk about the mitochondria too, because they're fantastic little guys. All right, so we know that doing the ketogenic diet results in producing ketones, which are then used for fuel. So they're converted from ketones into glycogen. It's stored in the liver, and from the liver as glycogen, converted into glucose, and then delivered to the muscle cells. Okay. All right. I hadn't listed, I think, much of this in the masterclass, and let's assume that you weren't on the masterclass. There are a lot of unbelievable benefits here. I mean, I'm not going to read them, but really, really amazing stuff. So you've got one of them, which I'm always interested in, is this protecting brain function. So as you've got this estrogen coming down, you've got, if you can bring keto in, you've got good chances of actually protecting the brain anyway. So it's almost like a counter to low estrogen from that point of view. A lot of other very, very interesting. I like this raising the levels of B3 because that's associated with age-related diseases. So that's also a very nice protective thing. And of course, the last one is what interests most menopausal women. It's the greater proportion of fat loss from the waistline,
Yeah.
It's like one of those things where you look down and you go, where did that come from?
Yeah.
So it's all good. Nice stuff. Okay, so we're on the issue of mitochondria. And these little guys, I mean, I think you've done some, maybe you even remember from school yourself. Yeah. So the mitochondria are the little factories. They basically take the fuel and they convert it, or the nutrients, and they convert it into energy. So they're working hard. They work very hard. And we spoke about needing to rest the mitochondria, which is what intermittent fasting does, which is a great habit. Yeah. But they are the factories. They're in the cells, and they are responsible for producing our energy. And keto itself promotes the growth of mitochondria, or the production of mitochondria. So you can imagine that you want more rather than less mitochondria, because if they're going to be converting and there are more of them, your chances of staying lean are much better, much improved, because they are there to convert. If you've got smaller numbers and they're not very efficient, then your capacity to use your nutrients as fuel or as energy is diminished. So they're good guys. And it's interesting, actually. There's some stuff seems to be going on around this issue of certain cancers actually looking like they are mitochondrial dysfunction diseases. So I think that we've potentially got to a point in society where we are over-consuming nutrients, whether in drink or food form, and that's impacting very, very massively on the state of health of our mitochondria. And obviously not in a good way, because they are just not rested, they are overworked, they're also fairly constipated because of the fact that they're delivered glucose all the time, and they work very much better on a more keto type diet. So I think it's certainly one of the things that we would, I heard a stat that said if you birthed a child and raised them to cater to their mitochondria, that human could potentially live, I think it was about 180 years. Wow. I reckon 170, 180 years. Amazing. Sure. And there are a couple of people on this planet who are making it their life's purpose to live beyond the normal age by taking care of the mitochondria. So they're really, really important. And I think I said to you, we discussed the fact that natural death happens through mitochondrial dysfunction and telomere shortening in the DNA. So mitochondria are just so vital. Okay, so you can see the symptoms of a dysfunctional mitochondria also quite extreme, actually. Sure. Yeah, I mean, obviously, as I say, certain kinds of cancers, but then also there's age-related disorders like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, which no one really wants to have to think about.
Scary.
Yeah. I had a quote here. According to the Charlie Foundation for Ketogenic Therapies, mitochondrial disorders are the result of genetic mutations, which can be either inherited or caused by environmental aggressors. Inherited mutations are generally more widespread and impact multiple organ systems. So that list is really a result of that. So we have to keep in mind that we're not just, it used to be this whole idea that we were what our genes suggested we were, but actually it's about whether you switch them on or not. and then about how you take care of something as simple as the mitochondria in the cells. So it's really all about lifestyle, I think. It's all about what you're choosing to do with your body and what you're exposing it to, and, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, I think seeing my mom land up with Alzheimer's, I mean, it's just, it was the worst, absolute worst. So
that must have been really tough.
So that's when I say I need to make lifestyle changes, because I'm not getting old that way. I'm not doing that to my family.
No. That's very hard. Yeah. No, that I'm sure wasn't easy to see her transition, you know. Other things, obviously, that keto protect against also is heart disease. Things like, in fact, we'll cover this very at a very deep level when we cover cholesterol, because it's really interesting also to look at the, you know, what's out there in terms of what's the normal kind of take on cholesterol, and then what the sort of more, to my mind, more holistic view on it, and perhaps a more cutting edge kind of understanding of it, and how that fits into the keto. But you can see here, I mean, the things that impact on cholesterol are triglycerides, high density lipoprotein, and low density lipoprotein, essentially. So keto promotes a low triglyceride count, which is exactly what you want. So when you have a cholesterol test, they're looking to make sure your triglyceride count is low. It gives you an increase in the HDL, which is great because that's associated with lower risk of heart disease. So you want your HDL levels to be higher, triglycerides low, HDL high, and keto promotes both of that. And then it also gives you a better particle size of LDL. So you've got essentially low density lipoproteins, and then you've got very low density lipoproteins. So you've got these two particle sizes, and again, we'll cover it in more detail. But the larger the particles are, the lower your risk. And that's got to do with the smaller they are, the more chances they have of oxidizing in the arteries and causing damage through that oxidation, because they're very, very small. So they get through, and they then oxidize and cause this inflammation. So we'll chat about that. But what you do need to know is that it improves this particle size. So it increases the number of larger particles, and the larger particles are not problematic at all. So if you have a cholesterol test and your LDL is very high, if your LDL is high versus your VLDL, then you're okay, because they're large, fluffy kind of particles, and they don't tend to get into the bloodstream and oxidize and cause damage. Okay. So yes, also leads to reduced number of total LDL particles in the bloodstream over time, but it can take a little while to do that. And that's the thing about keto and cholesterol, is you may see it go up initially and then it settles back down again. That worries people sometimes, is seeing that increase. Okay.
And as far as those tests are concerned, I mean, annually, when should one have them done?
Well, the other thing we're going to talk about is that our cholesterol should be rising in menopause. So, you know, I think if all your other markers are, like your triglycerides are down and your HDL is high, how often would I do it? I think it probably depends on how much potential for inflammation there is in your life in general. Through your diet, through your lifestyle, through your stress levels. Probably annually is not a bad idea, just to give you an idea of trend. I mean, if it's static for 3 years and you don't change any habits, then it's not really going to change, and maybe you go to every 2 years or longer. But if there's if something is showing up, you know, to be fair, how often do I have mine? I guess the nice thing about the NHS here is they do what they call a well woman check on an annual basis, and they just do it for you. So it's lovely. That system is great. It's a little bit of a struggle sometimes to get appointments and tests and things, but I never complain about it. It's great. It's very, very fortunate. Okay, so just looking at Yeah, I've got a note here, but I think we might leave that. Yeah, I think we'll leave that for another time. Okay, fat adaptation, should I say. So this is that conversion from your body relying on carbs to your body relying on fat. And I mentioned previously this idea of carb flu, and I don't know if you went through it or if you know that you fat adapted. Jenny, when you started keto, did you ever get to that, kind of running through that carb flu?
I think the very first time I did it, I did experience the
okay.
In fact, the not being able to sleep was funny. And maybe because I was hungry, I wasn't able to. But this was the very first time I tried it.
Yeah.
But, I mean, nothing now.
And energy-wise, do you remember feeling like pup or?
Yeah, I do. But the very first time I did this, I think it was about 10 years ago.
Oh, okay.
And I remember, that was quite a.
Yeah.
Quite a change.
Yeah.
But I think because mostly I've cut out carbs for a long time. I think it's like the intermittent fasting. It's not an issue.
No, you just don't think about it anymore. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But definitely, I'm going to have to look at then the below 30 grams.
That's the only change, I think, for you. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think potentially you are fat adapted. And, so you would have gone through maybe some of those symptoms, but your adaptation signals. So, of course, you can use a keto stick. You can, any number of tests that you can have. I'm not wild about you getting too involved in, I never recommend apps because I think apps can lead to very rigid behavior around diet. And it's like the keto sticks. When we start kind of stressing about whether we're we're in ketosis or not, and I think that we can become quite potentially obsessed over the numbers.
Yeah.
And I just think it's better to just tune in and have a feel and see how you just register what you're feeling, because that's a much sounder and healthier way to actually, because eventually instinct or intuition will be where you're going to look for whether or not you're doing the right thing at the right time for you. If I put a meal together and for some reason I just feel like more protein, I'm just going to take more protein, because I've gotten to the point where I trust my body to tell me. And it's not like, you often hear women joke about, I've got my period, I must have chocolate. It's not a shallow understanding of what the body needs. It's a very deep one. And we're going to cover the body's food language in a future session too. So that will develop your intuition and your instinct around what is right for you and what isn't in the moment as well. So energy should always be better and more and consistent in general. That gives you a very good sure sign that you are fat adapted if you're on a keto diet. Losing body fat is another one. That's an obvious one. You're looking for that. Cravings for sure are diminished, particularly sugar cravings. I mean, that usually when clients come to me and say, I'm craving sugar, I typically will say to them, I reckon we can sort that out in one meal. And they never believe it. And because usually in my experience, it's too low fat content and too high a carb. And the minute they switch it, I mean, the stories they've told, they've come back and been so excited because they're no longer in the grip of this sugar craving, Yes. So my thing is always, if you crave sugar, take more fat. If it sorts it, great. If it doesn't, look back on that meal. It may be too much fat, but it's not likely. Most people go the other way. They don't take enough fat. Yeah. But again, we'll come to that. Mind clear and focus. So that's definitely one of the things that, in fact, that comes out of intermittent fasting as well as this clarity and the capacity to focus. And then endurance is another one. It's quite interesting that it affects endurance. But so those are the things those will tell you if you're fat adapted. And I'm going to assume that you've experienced those.
Yes.
And you probably will find there might be a little shift as you go down to 30 grams.
30,
you might, something might happen there. It'd be interesting to see, actually.
Just a quick question.
Yes.
That using the sheets you gave us from Tim Noakes,
The traffic lights.
That's basically what I'm going to use. I'm not going to go into any apps or whatever. If I use that,
no, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's pretty comprehensive. Covers most of what you need. Yeah. Okay, so I put this in because I think it's important just to be aware. We're not going to be doing a long-term ketogenic diet because we're going to bring in keto cycling for you, but with Alsona, we're going to be bringing in the sort of perimenopause phases of the cycle. So you guys are slightly different, but neither of you are in danger of this, assuming you follow, the guidelines. So things like mucus lining being impacted on, and I can remember when I first did, because there was no research around females when I started, and it was just like everything was done on men, and men deal with it in a much better way because they don't have the sensitivity that we have hormonally. And I can remember, things like very dry eyes, and that's a mucus lining thing, which can be the long-term consequence or the consequence of long-term low carb. Other was constipation, because you are reducing the starches, which essentially are your probiotics, prebiotic, so it's their food, and so there are a couple of things that I experienced, which was quite good to experience, actually, because I can relay that to others. So it could impact on thyroid. There's your brain fog and fatigue. Low insulin, and insulin is an incredibly important hormone. We'll cover that now. Low estradiol, so there's your female sex hormone. So if I was working with someone who wanted to have children, I would probably just be cautious about how low and for how long they go. High estrogen, which is your fat storage, and cortisol. There's your cortisol coming in. So typically when insulin is low, cortisol rises, and then often how we manage stress hormone is excessive stress hormone is to pack the weight on around the middle. But a degree of insulin is very important, and you can see, all these other fantastic kind of benefits we get from producing insulin. Those are certainly worth experiencing. So it's not really, it's not even a good idea for men to be doing keto 24/7. And that's why I bring in the concept of keto cycling, is that we take the benefit of it from a point of view of weight loss and brain protection and all the other bits and pieces that come out of that. But we also bring in a day of high carb or a meal or two of high carb, so that we are constantly kind of shifting states and benefiting from them rather than suppressing, because keto is a famine diet, essentially. So is intermittent fasting. So the coupling of them is highly beneficial, but it is a famine diet. So we need to bring in the feast as well. Okay. Again, some of this stuff. And I've got 50 grams because that's the standard keto cycling, but you bring it down to 30 for you. And Jenny, on a day where my suggestion is always 3-1-3. So 3 days of keto, 1 day off keto, and 3 days of keto. That's how I would run it. But if you struggle with that, you could do 2-1-2-1. That just means twice a week you're going to have a high carb day. So I would go 3-1-3 if you can manage it. And so you would do 3 days with 30 grams and below, and then you bring in 1 day where you take whatever meals you're having and you make it high carb. And you can see what the best choices for your feasting carbs are. I would say when it's one of your busiest days, you're going to go high on, high end on that scale of carbs. If it's been a very sedentary day, then maybe you take it up to 50 and you just do a standard sort of keto day, or 60, somewhere in the lower regions. If you've been particularly active, let's say you've gone for a run, and you're up doing your job. I mean, you're on your feet a lot for your job. So if it's a particularly busy day, then make sure you bring in enough carbs. It's very important for females again. Okay, so
3-1-3.
3-1-3.
So you say high carbs 50 to 200 grams. Wow,
it's quite a lot.
It's quite a lot.
Yeah. Actually, I struggle to get that in, and you know, there are 2 days a week where I teach an indoor HIIT cycle class, which annihilates glucose, you know, from the cells, and I still struggle. I mean, I get to the end of the day and I think, because I also, like you, I've just become so used to this keto and fasting, and the periods, like I'm going to go through it now for Elsona's sake, phases through that cycle where I think, I have to remember to eat something in the morning because it's natural for me to fast, but actually it's not ideal.
So you don't actually fast on that day. You don't fast on the day where you have.
So the keto cycling, it's an interesting question. In the perimenopausal phases, you wouldn't fast on certain days. Would I bring it in for the menopausal? I would be inclined to maintain the intermittent fasting in menopause.
Okay.
I would. Okay. Even though you're keto cycling, I would still keep it in, because I think because we don't have to worry about things like wanting to fall pregnant. It's not really going to. We so don't need to worry about that stuff. I would keep the IF in, but I would definitely cycle off. Obviously, if you have one of those days where you wake up and you know it's your high carb day and you just are particularly hungry, it's not a train smash. I mean, there's nothing that's going to be particularly detrimental to you to bring in a bit of carb where you don't bring in some food where you don't normally. It's not going to change anything, because most of what you do is what you do. And so that was my point too, is, 75% of the time you do what you do, and then at other times you can let your hair down. I'm just thinking if there's anything else on this. No, I think that covers. Have you got any other questions on that before we just go?
For instance, you've got a function coming up, so could you then maybe keep it for the day? I've got a function.
That's exactly what I would do. Yeah, it's exactly what I would do. Yeah, and a glass of red wine is quite low in carbs. So you don't, but yes, I would do exactly that, so that you can just enjoy yourself and not worry about it,
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
All right. So just for Elsona's sake, this is it's quite a nice. This is what I follow as well. It's David Yocker's protocol, and it works quite nicely for me. So she's obviously got to work out what her cycle is. We had that conversation about the loop and where the cycle starts and where she is in that. Yes. So once she's worked that out, or Elsona, I should be talking to you once you've worked it out, I would follow this protocol. So day 1 to 10 is where our estrogen levels are coming down. And so that makes us very, very resistant to insulin. So our chances of storing fat from excessive carbohydrate intake are much higher in those first 10 days. So that's when you do intermittent fasting and you couple it with a very low carb intake. So here's your 30 grams and below is on these days. Okay, that's for the first 10 days. And then day 11 to either 14, 15, or 16, depends when you ovulate. So you're looking for signs and symptoms to tell you or you could do the ovulation thermometer. Estrogen is rising, so we're much more insulin sensitive, so we can afford to take more carbs in, and we should, because estrogen is rising. So you would feast, you wouldn't do intermittent fasting in this, and you would take your carbs to between 80 and 200. So again, if you're very, very active, take it up to 200. If you're not so active, keep it below 100. And then you just repeat this. So day 15 or 16, whenever you start when you finish ovulation, you go until day 22 and you repeat what you did day 1 to 10. So, you're doing your IF and you're doing very low carb. And then again, day 23 until day 1 of your period. And obviously day 1 is the day that bleeding starts. And so whenever that is, day 23 to whatever, you will feast. So no intermittent fasting, and then high carbs again. So and I think I might have mentioned this before, it's so irritating being, perimenopause is typically because you don't know, things are starting to change. And so for me, I get very excited about oh, I've got some high carb phase coming up, and I get very, amped to do various things. And then often, and that'll be day 23, and then often like day 24, my period will start. So I'm like, oh, I just missed, I maybe had one day of it, and then because my period's all over the place, so it's not very stable, so it can come at any time, and that's really annoying. So anyway, Elson, if you have any questions about this particular thing, let me know and we can discuss it. But that's fairly simple, I think, to follow, so that should work for you. And then I thought it would be useful just to cover a sample diet, because that's, I think that's worth looking at. This is, your top one is someone who is menopausal and following the keto, or it's your perimenopause day 1 to 10 or 15 to 22. So this is your intermittent fasting plus 30 grams or below. So, and it's quite interesting to me. I often get to the end of a day. Actually, yesterday was one of those days. I'm trying to remember what I had for lunch. I had a lamb shank for dinner with some celeriac, smashed celeriac, which is, I don't think we get it in South Africa. I think I discovered it for the first time in the UK, and it tastes like celery, but it's this big bulb, and it's very nice as a mash. It's like doing a collie mash, I guess. And I had that with a whole lot of sauce and onions and carrots and this beautiful big lamb shank, and then something else for lunch that was more based on also, there was just no carb in it. There was no carb in it at all. I got to the end of the day and I thought, I wonder if I've had enough carb. Certainly haven't had too much, and it certainly wasn't anywhere over 30 grams, but just totally satisfied. No snacks, just 2 meals, heavy on the fat, good degree of protein coming in, and just, when you get the keto thing right, there's no reason to be hungry at all. There's just no reason for it, and it can be incredibly satisfying. When you get to that point, you get to the end of the day and you think, oh, I actually haven't really had any carbs. So we keep an eye on it, but it becomes easier and easier to forego them and actually fuel yourself quite well anyway. So that particular day was probably a 20 gram, if I think about it, with, the quinoa would have actually added that carb in. But the rest is just above ground vegetables. There's nothing in those, nothing in salad. So that's quite a nice, that's a sort of gives you a nice idea of, and if you pack enough fat into that, you'll be satisfied, for Elsiners, or actually if you're doing your keto cycling day, this is an example of that. So you could, I've said I would suggest continuing with the intermittent fasting, but if you wanted to bring in, maybe they serve oats in the hostel and it's cold and you kind of feel like it because you haven't had it for a while, and it's just something nice to bring in. So I would always throw some fat in there, some melted butter, or I'd pour cream on top and maybe have some xylitol or some stevia or something with that. Or you could bring in your raw maple syrup. What's that?
Oat bran. How does that compare? Oat bran.
Oat bran versus rolled oats.
Yeah.
So oat bran you don't cook. Oat bran is just bran, right? That's just insoluble fiber. So that's not the same as, I was thinking, like your alternate to rolled oats is oatmeal, where they've ground it, and it's almost like a mealie meal, like a maize meal. So oat bran, it's just a insoluble fiber. So you bring that in. What do you use that for? Are you just adding fiber to your diet with that?
No. Yeah. So the oat bran. I must take a picture of the box for you.
Yeah.
The nutritional value when I get another one.
Yeah.
So I would use that, let's say, in plain yogurt.
Okay.
Just to add fiber, because I battle with constipation.
Okay.
And also, if I make something like a meatball or a fish cake, instead of putting bread in it, I actually use oat bran to help with the binding with egg.
Yeah. So you could. Yeah. Okay. Let me send me a pic when you've got one.
I'll do that.
There's some interesting stuff around. So constipation would in my experience, is more linked to fat, the amount of fat in your diet, and water, and also stress levels. Be quite interesting. There's also, when we have time, we can at some point talk about other diets, because there is Paul Saladino's kind of big work on the carnivore code, which is essentially his take on why, where we come from from an anthropological point of view, and how plants have a degree of toxins in them, which they do from a point of view of protecting themselves against predators like bugs and things that would chew them up. And these toxins are essentially what the plant uses to protect itself, in the same way that a tiger has claws and fangs, or an animal can run. Plants have their own defense mechanism. And so it's very backed by science, very interesting, actually, thoroughly researched. And so his take is that we eat far too many vegetables. And actually, when he goes into the point about fiber and unpacking it, what is really interesting is he shows how very little research there is to support plant fiber improving constipation or bowel movements or any of that. There just isn't the support for it that I assumed that there was, given what I've read and heard. And so it's quite interesting. Stats on anything can be Jenny left. What happened there?
Sorry, I just dropped.
Oh,
it's terrible. Sorry about that. I'll go back to the recording. You don't have to worry about repeating it all. Sorry.
Okay, all right. No, so it will be interesting. I think my point was just to say it'll be interesting to see what we can do with fat, a little more fat in your diet, maybe a bit more water, maybe some relaxation techniques, in terms of improving that. Anyway, so this is just an example. So, I know you don't eat bread, but maybe it's a baked potato or sweet potato or something like that you can add in there instead. So if we end up with questions around the diet stuff, we can try and put some time aside to actually be quite personal with that, and maybe throw some examples around, and I can talk through what I tend to do. So if we have time at some point through the course itself, we can do that. Okay, any questions at this point around that, Jenny?
No, this is all good.
Okay, perfect. So I just wanted to finish with two aspects to intermittent fasting. The one was, you've been doing this, but it was just to, I think, for Elsina's sake, and just maybe some points you didn't know around fat adaptation. So, Elsina, I always think, and Jenny, actually, this is a point for discussion, because I've had some clients who've actually said they prefer to skip dinner. I can't conceive of going to bed on an empty stomach, but one or two of them have said they prefer that to breakfast, because they are very attached to breakfast. I think breakfast is the easiest one to throw out, because we're typically quite busy in the morning, and if you can just set your breakfast later and later, eventually you get to the point where it's just lunch and dinner and it's fine. So I always think starting the fast in the morning, because you've already had that sleep time, and then you're in, so one can always start with a shorter fast and build it. Okay, so fasting is easier when you're fat adapted, and vice versa. So easier to get fat adapted when you're fasting. So the two work so beautifully together. They really are worthwhile pairing, because the benefit is so enormous. And I think that's where I've had my biggest gains. If I think about leanness, I was always small, and I went through very lean phases, and then normal phases, and then I got into keto, and then that just when I started practicing intermittent fasting on top of keto, it was just like, it was a game changer. It was a complete game changer. So it's a great one.
Some people, like I know I have my sister-in-law, she won't eat after 4 o'clock. She it's for her.
Yeah.
So I think maybe that thought of going to bed when you've still got food in your tummy, and you haven't used that energy.
Yeah, so 3 hours, minimum 3 hours before you go to bed. So you should never eat closer than 3 hours, because that can cause damage to the mitochondria, because then you've got a whole lot of fuel in the cells that then, it's held there, and then you go to sleep. So everything starts to slow down, and you get a leaking through the cell wall that in turn can damage the cells. And so that's my understanding of this excessive energy going in last minute. So it's not a great habit, but equally for me, so it just depends on the person. 4 o'clock is just way too early. I'll be hungry. So if I eat at 6, I sometimes might need a little snack before I go to sleep. And because I can't, for me personally, going to sleep on an empty stomach doesn't work. It actually wakes me up, and I think it's more a cortisol thing. It's a blood sugar drop, and then as my adrenals produce cortisol to bring blood sugar back up again, it wakes me up. So I actually sleep very well on carbohydrates in the evening. So I will tend to either eat rice or potatoes or some kind of starchy carb in the evening. I sleep beautifully on that. Yeah. All right. So we've spoken about the fact that the body carries reserves of fatty acids, and so that's where the fat adaptation is useful, combined with it's the keto and the fasting, basically. All right, and then finally, just kind of looking at the feeding. Jenny, can you see the notes easily enough? Are they very small?
Yeah.
Looks like, oh, okay. No. It looked like you were struggling for a moment.
No.
All right. So during the fasting period,
I want to because we teach using Teams. I want to move your slides.
press, and there's nothing happening. That's funny. Actually, I was on a call today with my marketing coach, and I'd switched my top light off, and then she was sitting in front of me with the same top light, but in hers. I was like, didn't I just turn that off? She's like, no, it's mine. That was hilarious. It's just like perspectives are so, it's weird, just very strange. Anyway, okay, so during the fasting period, you can do teas, you can do coffees, you can do water, no nutrients in them. Any nutrient is going to fuel the liver to some degree. So, yeah.
Okay.
So,
my coffee.
Yeah, that's not fasting. I have a lot of clients come and say, but can't I just put a little bit in? I'm like, well, you can, but why would you? Because you break the fast. I mean, it's not like you're going to break it massively if it's a dash of milk. It's not like it's going to change the world. But you can also do bone broth. This is another one, and whey. Those are the other two things that don't break the fast, because they're bringing in amino acids in their most basic form, which is incredibly beneficial, especially if you're active in the mornings. I can remember when I was doing my morning, I do quite long pole dancing. The pole sport sessions were quite intense, and I would always do a shot of whey before and a shot of whey after. And whey is the most disgusting thing you'll probably ever taste. It's like drinking cottage cheese water, if you can imagine it, or like the water that feta has sat in. It's gross. And I used to hold my nose and just toss it back. But anyway, those are great because they bring in the proteins in their raw form, but they don't impact on your fast. So keep that in mind as well. And obviously, because you're now pulling down on the amount of food that's coming in, whatever you do eat must be of a higher nutrient value or quality. Not for every meal, of course. If you're going to let your hair down and have pizza and beer, that's not exactly nutritious. But that's not going to happen every day. So as much as you can, you want to make sure that what you do eat is of a very high quality. And don't actively restrict calorie intake. When you're in both of you are quite active. So you're not looking to reduce calories. That's not something, firstly, I would ever get into anyway, because I don't think anyone should be counting anything. But just don't think about being in a diet mode while you're doing this. So 2 meals and a snack, if you need the snack, should keep you energized. You should be stable, totally satisfied. And I would think you should last for around about 4 hours on whatever you've had before, with sufficient amounts of fat in it. that really should be more or less what you're looking for. And if you're not lasting that long, then I would suggest that it's because you're not putting enough fat at lunch, because obviously it's after lunch that you're looking at potentially bringing that snack in, unless it's a very long gap between lunch and dinner, of course. If it ends up being 7 hours or something, or 6 hours, you might need something. So,
question.
Yeah. Yes.
I drink collagen, and I normally drink that in the morning. So now that I shouldn't have that until I come out of fasting.
Well, collagen is essentially the same as doing your whey protein, because it's just a pure. There's no true nutrient value in that in terms of energy production. It's repair. You're giving raw materials to. So I wouldn't necessarily, unless it's in a product that makes it palatable, in which case that's a different story.
As it is.
Okay, no, I don't think that would be problematic. As I say, I think you're dealing with the pure amino acids as opposed to any other bits and pieces coming in there. But there's also no harm in doing it later in the day either, the collagen. So you could experiment with it. I don't think it would make a big difference. Okay, Jenny. So that's kind of hopefully we've covered. It's a big topic. It is, and it's very it's fairly kind of dry, but and you're doing it already.
Interesting.
Oh, okay.
That's
good.
Nice. I love it.
All right, so I'll send the recording through, and then if you girls have any questions, we can deal with that next time as well, and just see if you can apply any of this. I mean, you're both in a pretty good space, I think, but I think it's useful to know the background stuff anyway. So,
anyway.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome.
Super.
Thank you so much.
I hope you sleep well.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Okay.
Night.
Okay.
Bye.